Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So we are going to continue talking about observations that are going to allow Darwin to piece together this idea of natural selection, of evolution. And one of the biggest things that he recognizes as he is both journeying on the Beagle and then just studying organisms around his own home is the sheer variation that exists within populations. So when we talk about a variation, it's just a difference in a particular trait among members of the same species. So when we look at just the group of children here in the picture, the variation in their hair color, in their skin tone, in the shape of their nose, the shape of their eyes, the probably height differences if we were to stand them all up. There is copious amounts of variation that we can see with our own eyes. And ultimately, we're going to find, not that Darwin understands this in his lifetime, but we ultimately discover that that's really genetically controlled, and that's going to become another layer to the theory of evolution post-Darwin, and something that we spend a lot of time utilizing as a way to study evolution now. So that variation exists within populations. That's another big thing to keep in mind. Go back to your organizational levels, and we're talking about a group of individuals of the same species living in a particular area at the same time. So when we talk about evolution and the way that it occurs, what we're really going to be talking about are things that are happening at these population or these species levels. Um, Variation is going to exist within the members of that species, within the members of that population that are going to allow the natural selection process to work. But ultimately, the work of natural selection is going to occur at the population level. So individuals of a population exhibit a wide range of variations in those traits. And like I mentioned a moment ago, those variations are ultimately because of variations in their genetic codes for that trait. So when we look at somebody who has brown hair, the set of instructions in their DNA that codes for that brown hair, the series of nucleotides, is slightly different than when I go looking at the sequence of nucleotides in the DNA of somebody who has blonde hair. So you make different sets of instructions because you're ultimately creating different traits. One of the things that becomes a big influence for Darwin is the idea of artificial selection. So he recognizes that humans for generations have been choosing organisms with specific characteristics as breeding stock, whether that's from a crop standpoint or a livestock standpoint. We're constantly choosing parental organisms that have traits that we want. We mate them together in hopes that the offspring also have those characteristics. The more we do it, the more successful we tend to be in getting what we want for the following generation. So, artificial selection, take a look at all those plants, all those vegetables, the cauliflower, the cabbage, the Brussels sprouts, all of these vegetable species, these organisms, were originally derived from a wild mustard plant. But we bred them together for uh, bigger leaves or bigger flowers or bigger this or that in order to get the traits that we wanted for a particular purpose, and now they look like these different vegetables that we're used to seeing in the grocery stores. Another big influence of artificial selection, British love their dogs. And so they were very adept at breeding different breeds of dogs for different purposes. And so this has also been happening again for hundreds to thousands of years. And all of these organisms are of the same species. They're all Canis lupus. They're all dogs. They're all domesticated dogs. And yet we see this huge variety of breeds within that because humans have chosen parental characteristics, mated those parents together, and after doing that for long periods of time, over many, many generations, we get these different breeds for certain traits that were considered desirable for whatever reason they were going to be using that dog, whether it was a hunting dog, a shepherding dog, um, whatever the case might be. So Darwin was very much attuned to this idea of artificial selection. Let's go back to the Galapagos for a second. So again, he's going to make incredible amounts of observations while he's on these islands. And it's ultimately going to be a huge player in the development of his theory of evolution and natural selection. That being said, while he's on these islands, he really has no idea what he's looking at. It's not until he gets home, back to Great Britain many years later, that he starts to piece together what he was seeing. And one of the things that he saw, and he's probably most famous for knowing, or identifying, are these different finch species. So while he's on the islands collecting them, he thinks they're all just different birds. But once he gets home, he starts to recognize that no, in fact, these all appear to have similar origin, and yet their beak shape is what is considerably different. He also, in the process of making those observations, thankfully kept track of other things on the island, one of which being major food sources for these guys. So he starts to suggest that perhaps all of these species were, in fact, one at some point in Earth's history. He also recognized that these finches also existed back on the mainland of South America. So he starts to suggest, could there have been some jump when these islands might have been closer to the mainland for these birds to have gotten back and forth, eventually getting trapped on those islands. The islands spread apart, they eventually get trapped on their own individual island, and evolutionarily changed beak shapes based on the major food sources that were present. So that all of these different beak varieties used to exist within the population on the mainland, then used to exist on each island, but they got weeded out by not being able to access their food sources as successfully as others. So if I am a seed-eating beak shape on an island predominated by insects, I have nothing to eat. So what happens to me? I die. And if I die without reproducing, then my trait of this big beak never gets passed on. And instead, something like this smaller beak to feed on insects inside trees might be more successful because that's the food source that's available. So these guys, although they used to exist on that island, have basically died out entirely. And so the only genetic information left on that island is for information to produce this shaped beak because that's what's most successful there. And that's really, he starts putting together this idea of natural selection. So we now understand evolution as this change in successive generations, one generation after the next. There's this slow accumulation of change over time. And those changes are a result of random mutations, so changing your DNA code, changing your set of instructions, as well as changes in the organism's surroundings, so things in the environment. And we now study evolution really at two levels. Your microevolution, which we'll talk a little bit about later, are changes in the trait frequencies, the allele frequencies, the brown allele versus the blonde allele, right? And how common are those different characteristics in the population? And we're studying it really from there, from one generation to the next. You may also come across this as genetic evolution. We're looking at your genes, we're looking at your DNA, and looking at how that changes the frequency of those characteristics in a population change over time. Macroevolution is really what Darwin was getting at, where he's looking at this process in which new species are developing from ones that already exist. These big scale changes as opposed to what's maybe just happening within the genetics of the organism. Although genetics is certainly playing a role in the way that it works, he didn't understand that at the time. Um, so microevolution or genetic evolution is one level at which we can study it, and we're much better at studying those levels of evolution now, given our ability to do DNA sequencing and isolate DNA and things like that. up until probably within the last 30, 40, maybe even 50 years, that wasn't even feasible for us. So all of the evidence for evolution from Darwin's time up until at least then was macroevolution, or that biological evolution, looking at major scale changes, fossil records, big morphology changes, structural changes in organisms, so on and so forth. So let's talk about how Darwin's theory ultimately comes about. What are some of the major components to this? And you should be able to describe these by the time you get to the test. First and foremost, members of a population have to have variations within the traits of their population that are heritable. They have to be variations within characteristics that they can pass on genetically to their children. So things like eye color, hair color, skin color, height, the ability to break down certain nutrients, whatever the case might be, that has to be something that is coded for in your DNA, because ultimately when you create the next generation, the only thing that really gets transferred is that genetic information. We also have to have an overpopulation, and this is where Mathis kind of plays a role in Darwin's thinking. So in a population, there has to be more individuals produced than the environment can actually support. They have to compete for each other. There has to be a struggle for survival. Because if everybody is capable of getting every resource that they need to survive and reproduce, then there is no adjustment. There is no better characteristic to better your survival than somebody else. So think about this analogy. You take a truckload of Oreos into a kindergarten classroom and just dump them in the middle of the floor and tell the kids to go at it. Well, if you just keep dumping Oreos in there, then everybody's going to be able to stuff their face until they're sick and everybody goes home satisfied, right? There's no necessity for somebody to be bigger or stronger or faster at getting those Oreos because there's more than enough. If I were to do the same thing and put 2 Oreos in the middle of a classroom of 25 kindergartners, somebody's coming out a winner, and most of them are coming out without Oreos, right? Because somebody's going to be able to get there faster, who's going to be able to be stronger to push somebody else out of the way. There has to be that competition, and that's kind of what this concept is talking about here, is that there has to be a struggle for survival. Somebody has to be able to obtain resources better than somebody else, and so as a result, outcompete and outreproduce somebody else so that their traits are the ones that are getting passed on more often to the next generation than the person or the individual who isn't able to obtain those resources quite as well. And so that's going to ultimately lead to this idea of descent with modification. So descendants, offspring, generation over generation, spread into various habitats over millions of years into these diverse landscapes, ecosystems, and that while living in those habitats for long enough, that organisms that are naturally found there will acquire a certain set of characteristics, a certain set of traits that allow them to survive and reproduce best in that environment. Move into a different environment, and it's now perhaps a new set of traits, a different set of traits that is more beneficial. So taking a snowshoe hare out of the tundra and dropping them into the middle of the desert, probably not going to do so well, right? Because that rabbit is got a very thick white coat meant to keep them warm, meant to help them blend in from being attacked by predators in an environment dominated by snow. But I dropped them in the middle of the Arizona desert and now they don't blend in at all. In fact, they stick out like a sore thumb. They don't have the capacity for maintaining enough water to stay hydrated. And they're just going to sweat their tushes off because their coat is so thick. So they're not going to be able to survive there. Different set of rabbits have evolved a different set of traits to be more successful in that environment. And so it's sort of this idea of survival of the fittest. So whoever has the set of characteristics that are best adapted to the environment that they're currently living in is going to enable them to survive and reproduce better than those who aren't. So if I take a look down here at these peppered moths, right, these guys are clearly better suited for their environment because they're blending in and staying away from the predators. This guy, he's going to be easy pickings. All right. Be careful with this idea of survival of the fittest, though, because we're not talking about necessarily physical fitness in the sense of being strong or fast. You just need to be better at surviving and reproducing. And that's the other piece, big piece right here. Circle it, highlight it, star it. It's not just about survival either. It's about survival and reproduction. You have to out-reproduce somebody else because it's ultimately going to be a matter of you reproducing more, meaning that you are passing on your traits more often to cause a balance shift in the characteristics that exist in the next generation. So that as natural selection progresses, you have an increasing number of individuals every generation who have these adaptive characteristics until it really becomes the predominant set of traits that we would typically associate with a set of species because they've lived in that environment long enough. The environmental conditions have stayed stable long enough that is, in fact, what is most adaptive for that organism in that environment. A couple other things while we're still on the topic of Darwin and Lamarck, things to avoid. When we talk about who's surviving, it's always the population level, never the individual. You can't change your genetics, at least not yet. And so individuals don't biologically evolve. The populations do. It's the populations that change. It's the species that change over time. And adaptations are only characteristics that the species have accumulated in the sense that those adaptations develop as characteristics in a species over long periods of time. It's the population that is accumulating those traits, is allowing those characteristics based on the survival and reproduction of individuals to become more common in the population. Not to confuse what Lamarck was talking about, where it's this accumulation of individual traits within yourself that you are passing on. Just because it allows you to survive better, if it's not coded for in your genetics, you're not going to be able to pass that trait on to your offspring. So ultimately, Darwin does describe his theory in a very long essay called On the Origin of Species. So because of things like Alfred Wallace, he ultimately does publish before he dies. So he publishes The Origin of Species in 1859.